founder Ben Gilby joins us today to talk about a growing competition, the National Premier League in Western Australia. Ben has followed this competition closely since its inception in 2020, providing excellent media coverage and passionately supporting the growth of football in WA. Thank you so much for joining us, Ben.
It's good to be here. Good to see you both.
So, first of all, what is the NPLW?
Hi, Ben.
So basically, it's like the second tier of women's football in Australia below the A-League women, although there is no promotion and relegation from the NPL into the A-League women. Each state and territory has got its own separate NPL league. Some states have got more than one. So, for example, New South Wales has got one that's mainly based around the Sydney metro area, and then there's another one, the northern New South Wales, which is based around Newcastle and the Hunter Valley. And then the other states have got their own ones. In terms of how they're perceived to be strength-wise, traditionally, I guess the East Coast, so New South Wales and Victoria in particular, would be where it's felt that it's a stronger competition because obviously there's more A-League women clubs based in those areas as well. So there's a bigger and potentially, bigger population potentially of those clubs to draw players from. But there is also promotion and relegation from the NPL to the various leagues underneath, which go down to quite local levels beneath that.
Okay, and can you give us an overview of the current state of the NPLWA?
Yeah, so I believe it's the youngest of all of the NPL competitions. So this is the 5th season. We've got 8 clubs in the competition. The previous 4 years, we've had 2 teams that have won it. So the league structure is there's a night series, which is kind of like a pre-season tournament. So that then there's the main league. So the 8 teams, everyone plays each other 3 times for 21 rounds. And then the top 4 playoff for the top 4 cups. And then there's also the States Cup, which is for the NPL clubs and then the clubs in the league below. So effectively, there's 4 trophies up for grabs each year. And the league has been won by only 2 teams so far in the 4 years that it's been going. That said, the strength in terms of competitiveness this season is better than ever. Although Perth Red Star have just clinched the league for the 3rd year in a row, I think the top 4 cup, you could make arguments for any of the teams in there winning it this year, which you couldn't necessarily have done before.
Very good, thanks. Denise, over to you.
That's a lot. It's a lot. So, I mean, I get it. So when you say WA, let's just roll back a bit. What do you mean?
So within the state of Western Australia, although, again, having said that, all of the NPL leagues, although they're effectively state leagues, the reality is all of the clubs are based around the state capitals. So the New South Wales League, most of the clubs, if not all of the clubs, are around the Sydney metro area. The one in Victoria is pretty much around the Melbourne situation we have in WA. So most of the clubs all of the clubs are in Perth, with the exception of Fremantle City, who are the next sort of city just up the river. Okay,
so that gives me a little bit better sort of sense of geography around the NPL, because NPL to me has always been kind of confusing. And so this is like a really important podcast to kind of like unpack what the NPL is. You mentioned 4 years. Is that how long it's been evolving, or has it been evolving longer?
So this is the 5th year of the NPL in Western Australia, and it's the youngest competition of all of them. So it's Western Australia is very much perceived to be, I don't want to say the backwater, but it is kind of perceived to be the backwater compared to the East Coast, which is where all the money is, all the attention is, the vast majority of the clubs are. There's only one professional club in the whole of Western Australia for a state that is the size of mainland Europe, for example. That's the situation. That's the reality of the situation. Sydney has got a couple of teams, depending on whether you're looking at women's and men's teams as well, and pro teams. Melbourne's got a number as well. as well. And, there's also the fact that, Perth is nearer to Singapore and Indonesia than it is to Sydney, for example. So there's that side of it as well, which makes it's very much, it's really sad that it's kind of almost forgotten about in a way, because everyone is so sort of tuned into what's going on the East Coast, and because there's so many major cities and it's the massive centre of population. Perth's got about 2 million people living in it. After Perth and Fremantle, the next biggest city in the state is, it's under 100,000, a long way under 100,000 in terms of population. And that, again, is for an area the size of mainland Europe.
Yeah, that's enormous.
Yeah.
That's enormous coverage. Okay, so we'll keep that in mind as we're talking about this league. And even though it seems like bunched up around Perth, that is a landmass, but also a landmass, with people. I mean, we kind of go, oh, it's a big country. There's a whole lot of nothing sometimes in Australia, but there are people. So we'll just kind of keep that humming in the back of our brains as to what this league is about. So how has it evolved? Like 5 years ago, some people got together, said, we're doing this. What's it like from then to now?
Yeah, so historically, the women's competition before then in the Perth area was heavily dominated by two clubs, Queen's Park and the Northern Redbacks. It was pretty much every year. It was, those two teams would be at the top of the table within a point or two of each other, and then there was a monumental gap between the other four teams in the league. So there was only 6 teams in the league back then. I mean, that was a massive gap. But then, controversially, when the NPL came in, Queen's Park were not given a place in the competition, which was a pretty major decision that was made. And also, a number of the traditionally strongest men's teams in the men's NPL do not have teams in the women's NPL. For example, Perth Red Star, who Northern Redbacks became now, they have men's teams. Originally they were a separate women's, so Northern Redbacks were a women's only club who are massively successful, both in sort of interstate competitions as well. They did phenomenal stuff. But obviously the reality of being a female only club was that there are issues with finances and their ground as well. So they merged. They came together a men's team. ECU Joondalup a couple of years ago, and they merged with them. So there's now no female-only club within the competition, which was quite a big move, and they've been massively successful as well across that transition. The other early successful team were Murdoch University Melville, who particularly this kind of took on most of the originally successful Queen's Park team, and they won the competition in the early stages. But since then, they've sort of slowly trailed off, and other teams have come in up to the top echelons. I think it's also worth pointing out that one of those 8 teams, the NTC, they're effectively the state representative under-18 team. So you have basically players that some of them can be 14, between the ages of 14 and 18, playing against some players that are experienced A-League women players in that competition week in, week out. But they've been hugely successful. This year, not so much because they had a massive cohort move on. Because obviously once they reach a certain age, they're no longer eligible to play. So last year, for example, 2023, they had the likes of George Cassidy, Grace Johnston, Tanika Lala, several others in that team, which was a phenomenal team. Obviously, they've all gone Ruby Cuthbert, so they've all gone got A-League contracts. So they've had a slightly more difficult year this year, but they've been massively successful as well, despite that handicap of, fielding really, really young players up against physically mature, experienced A-League players as well.
The next question is who runs the league? But I have another question. This is a quiz, Ben. Can you, in rapid succession, name the 8 teams in the league?
Yeah, so the top 4 the current time. So we've got 2 rounds of the regular season left. So Perth Red Star have just clinched the title for another year. Second place, we've got Perth Soccer Club, the Azzurri. Third place at the moment, we've got Balcatta Etna. Fourth place, we've got Fremantle City. And then further down beneath that, we've got, this is where it might not necessarily be in the right. Oh, yeah, fifth place would be NTC, Subiaco, who have been a massive success since they've come in. That's something we'll talk about in a minute. Murdoch University Melville and UWA Netherlands, who were the first team to ever get promotion into the league. They came into the league at the start of this season, and they've been really, really good, even though they're bottom and likely to finish bottom. They have been fantastic.
And so who puts this all together?
Well, it's run by Football West, so that's the governing body of football in Western Australia. So all of the NPL leagues are run by the governing body of football within that specific state. So Football New South Wales, Football Queensland, Football South Australia, for example, wherever that league is situated, the governing body for that state runs it.
And, what kind of challenges do they have?
I mean, in Western Australia in particular, the challenges are, particularly big because in terms of population compared to other states, there's a smaller number of players to draw from, potentially smaller than on the East Coast. The massive distances involved as well. So, for example, there's based in Perth, it's very difficult to get noticed. So, I mean, a couple of players, an example of that. I mean, Sneaker Lala is a prime example of that, and also Lydia Williams. Yeah, Sneaker Lala and Lydia Williams came from the same town, Goldfields town, Kalgoorlie, which is a very, very long way from anywhere. I mean, you're talking well over 5 hours in a car to get to Perth from there. So I was going to say it's not realistic to be doing that every week. It can be, but it's very, very hard when you consider that those players are not getting a wage really. So in order to do that around a job is massively difficult. There's a few players that have come up from the deep southwest, so like the area around Margaret River and sort of further in Bunbury and that sort of area as well. But again, it's hard for players that are out of that Perth spotlight. And equally, the other issue too, that's really been a long-term issue for women's football in WA is that effectively, if the players want to go on to international football, they kind of feel that they have to move to the East Coast because that's where the national team coaches are all based. If a national team coach wants to watch a player that's playing in WA or based in WA, it can be a 5-hour plane ride, and they don't necessarily make that 5-hour plane ride as often as they could or should really. So that historically, we lose all of our players over to the East Coast, and when they sort of start to make it. Interestingly, though, this year Perth Glory have brought 2 really big young players back from the East Coast for the next year's A-League Women's season. So Tiana McKenna, who was part of Melbourne City's grand final squad last year, she's come back home, which is really exciting. And I think potentially really, really exciting is Iskia Brookin, 14-year-old, who, she's the youngest ever A-League women player with Western Sydney Wanderers last year. There's been talk for quite a while that Chelsea were interested in her. She's left Western Sydney Wanderers and she's signed for Perth Glory next season. She's playing NPL at the current time, back with the NTC. So I think that's partly because now that the A-League Women has gone to a full home and away season. So it means that obviously players that are playing for Perth Glory are in WA for longer. And the way the season's structured now, that there's a slight overlap at the beginning and the end of the seasons. So there's been a lot more players that would normally have gone to play NPL in Victoria or New South Wales that have stayed this season.
Interesting. So there's this kind of vibe, like to get noticed, you have to go back east. You have to go back to the Sydneys and Melbournes and things. But yet there's been some pretty darn important people who have emerged from that part of the country. I mean, you mentioned Lydia Williams. I mean, obviously Sam Kerr, came from Western. Is there like a vibe, a Western Australia vibe that culturally you can describe a little bit?
I mean, it's women's. I mean, football in WA is a very small fish in a massive sports pond anyway. Women's football is that bit smaller again, because everything in Perth and WA, it's all Aussie rules, it's all AFL and the Waffle, the local state comp, and obviously now it's looking like Perth is going to get an NRL team again. So that's going to be another massive fight for attention. I think I always kind of think back to years and years ago when Western Australia petitioned to become an independent country, to break away from England and the rest of the thing. It wasn't a Commonwealth then, whatever you want to call it, the word sort of found me. There is this very much us and them scenario from the East Coast. It's all, I think if you particularly look back to the early, I know it's men's football, but if you look back to the early years of Perth Glory's men's team, when they entered what was then the league before the A-League came in, the sort of the crowds and the volume of support they were getting in what is now HBF Park. It was like something that you see on a big European club thing, And I think even if you look at sort of like the song lyrics of like, for example, West Coast Eagles AFL team, their sort of club song, it's all about the West Coast and the East Coast and people coming over, and we're here to represent the West Coast because we're different, and we're together.
Cool. I mean, it sounds like it's the thing. Like it is its own sort of league, its own sort of niche, its own sort of part of the world. I mean, like you said, closer to Asia than it is to Sydney, in some countries, closer to Singapore. Mm. So, I mean, let's wind this back into the league and the teams. I mean, how you mentioned the teams competing with each other. I mean, what's that like? Is there like a balance? You mentioned some teams are really good, some teams are just starting. How is that all working out?
I mean, this year is being so much more competitive. I mean, we've had a new team, UWA Netherlands, come into the league this year. They replaced Curtin University, who had really, really found it tough for all sorts of reasons for several years, or have been on the receiving end of some pretty monumental defeats. So I think it was really important. They introduced promotion and relegation. So UWA Netherlands came in from the league below for the start of this year. And obviously nobody really knew how they would do, because they pretty much had a team that hadn't played at NPL level before. And they've been fantastic to watch. They've been competitive. I mean, I was out there a couple of weeks ago at their ground. They played Perth Soccer Club, and the game finished 8-4. It was nuts. I mean, to be fair, Perth Soccer Club were sort of 4-5-0 up and kind of took the foot off the pedal a bit. But, for a team that have been down the bottom of the table all season, to come back and score 4 goals was incredible. And they've taken the lead against some of the top teams, against Perth Red Star, and sort of held that lead for sort of 20, 30 minutes. So it's been really good that the bottom of the table has been a battle all year long between two teams. And that hasn't really been the case before. So that in itself is great. Perth Red Star, they've won the league for the 3rd year in a row, which makes it sound like they're so much better than everyone else, and historically they are. But I think Perth Soccer Club this year, potentially Balcatta, now that they've added 2 top players in recent weeks, and Fremantle as well, I think you could argue that any of those 4 could take each other out in the finals at the end of the season. I've got to put a shout out for Subiaco, because they've got a huge women's and girls set up there. I mean, you go down to there. I mean, they've got a fantastic and it's a little ground, but it's lovely. You can go there on a Sunday, and you've got girls from like 5, 6 years old up to seniors over the age of 60, all in teams, all playing on the pitches at Rosalie Park on a Sunday. And they've come from finding it really tough in the early years. It took them they didn't win a game in the opening year, and it's taken them a while. But, they are now really competitive, and, they're probably maybe one or two signings away from competing for the top four. So, their development has been really, really good. And you've got the NTC, who this year have found it harder because, any team that had Tanika Lala, Georgia Cassidy, Grace Johnston, Ruby Cuthbert in last season and lost all those players because they sort of aged out of the system, are going to find it harder. They've not had a type of season that they've had before. I think it's worth pointing out that this year it will be 3 teams that have made the finals, the top 4, for the 3rd year in a row, which again kind of suggests that it's not a massively competitive league. But I'm kind of looking on the other side of it because both Perth and Fremantle have grown massively over that time. I mean, Perth Soccer Club can field a midfield at the moment that's got Tiara McKenna, Georgia Cassidy, Daisy McAllister, who's a great player, and Charlie Wainwright, who potentially is an A-League player as well. So any team that can field that midfield, and also have a 21-goal striker in 19 games up there is a team that, are rightly to be feared, I think.
So how just tell me a little bit more about why do these players play? Like who are maybe mention 2 or 3 names that you think are standouts in the league, and why do they play there?
I mean, effectively, the reason that most of the players and the vast majority of players play there is because that's where they sort of live or work or go to school. We have to recognise that this is, there's not massive finances involved here at all. Pretty much everyone involved in all of the clubs is a volunteer. So players that have come up from outside of Perth to play have kind of have decided that, maybe they want to try a better quality of football than what they were getting in their local competition. Or the players from the Goldfields. So, for example, we were talking about Tanika Lala, who's come up from Kalgoorlie. She was selected for the NTC, which is the state rep squad, as a young teenager. And while she spent a lot of time travelling from Kalgoorlie, eventually, she had to make the decision: do I move to Perth because I've got this ability in football, or do I stay down in Kalgoorlie? So she's made the move. I mean, she's in her 2nd year now with a pro contract at Perth Glory, and is potentially someone who can come and play in Europe. I think probably this time next year. So it's a local league in a way, and like in any sort of major city, the opportunities are in the major city, rather than particularly because all of the other sort of areas or other cities within WA are so much smaller. It's a very, very rural state.
So let's pretend Evie is a young player in the league. How does the league sort of support a young player?
That's something that will depend, like anything, on the club. Because some clubs will have the ability to have more staff than others, for example, because it is a voluntary led league, for example. There's not much money. I mean, you can go down on a Saturday or Sunday, and basically you can see kids that have come through the club from the really young age. So I know, for example, Ella Lincoln, who's the top goal scorer in the league this season, she's been at Perth Soccer Club since she was a very, very, very young kid, and so she's stayed there and she's progressed and she's become the player she is now. It's like anything; it just depends on the club. It depends on what the opportunities are there. For example, when we talked about Subiaco, you can go there and see girls from the age of 5 and 6 up to the age of over 60 just playing because they love it. And then you make the decision: do you want to do keep the social side of it, or do you want to try and make an opportunity to yourself, but making that opportunity obviously comes with massive sacrifices on your own, your work-life balance. Because there's some players, particularly about Qatar this year, for example, they can't play every week because of their work roster. For example, that's how it is. So and they are not players that as a coach you really want to be losing, because they are effectively two of their top goal scorers. But they can only play when they're not rostered onto work on a Saturday or Sunday.
Does the NPLWA attract any international players?
Yeah, it does. For example, so last year's top goal scorer, Reina Kagami at Perth Red Stars, she's Japanese. She had two of her country, two other Japanese players with her there last year. And there's two different ones with her there this year. So they've developed some really good links in Japan, which has been a really good thing for them in terms of how they've progressed. UWA Netherlands have got a couple of Americans, so Morgan Springer, goalkeeper. Also got Michaela Thorley as a striker too, who's American. I'm sure there's another one, but the name escapes me off the top of my head at the moment. I'm sure there is one more. And naturally, because of the way Australia is, there's an awful lot of players who are, for example, Italian by ancestry and that kind of thing as well.
So does the league support, or how does it support sort of the diversity of players in Australia? I'm thinking mostly Indigenous players. Do they have opportunities in this league? And can you just describe that a little bit? Yep.
Yeah, it's not ideal. I think we all have to recognise that the opportunities that are there for First Nations people in Australia are not what they should be. And that goes in all walks of life. There's been some sports within Australia that have been particularly good at attracting and retaining First Nations athletes. So, AFL was the prime example of that, albeit it comes with that caveat of some of the really quite outrageous sort of racial incidents that have happened. The Adam Goods scenario is one of those things. The famous documentary that was produced as a result of that. And going back to sort of the 70s and 80s, and sort of some of the famous sort of images of Nicky Winmar, who after he scored a goal in a game that he'd been abused by the crowd. It's very, very difficult, and it's not what we want it to be. And I think we also need to recognise probably that because football, if we're going on a WA focus in terms of the question, football is that bit smaller in terms of sort of eyes on TV. So it's not going to be as prominent in that respect. However, I think we do know that there are people trying to make a massive difference in that. We've seen ourselves what the likes of John Moriarty Foundation are trying to do, and I think it's going to need more than just the John Moriarty Foundation. It's a far bigger thing than that. It needs Football Australia to get a bit more involved, a lot more involved. But that's going to come with money, and that's going to come with what they see as the right priorities. So, that's a whole bigger question, a highly controversial one, for all sorts of reasons. But no, it's not ideal, and it's not what we want it to be. Because in an ideal world, the sort of ratio of Indigenous people to settler Australians, percentage-wise, would be represented in the league, in all leagues in Australia, and it's not.
Yeah, it seems it's a league that covers a vast amount of space, and that has its challenges if you're living ultra rurally, no matter what ethnicity you are. How do you get seen in some of the most remote places on this planet? and
if you are seen, you've got to effectively up stick and move, in some cases, thousands of kilometres without your family and without your parents. I mean, that's and a lot of the time these people, So I mean, Iskia Brookham we talked about. She moved from Perth to Sydney. She's 14 years old. She was playing for Western Sydney Wanderers last year. She's still got family support and all those kind of things, but just the sheer fact that you're taking a 14-year-old made a move to thousands and thousands of kilometres away. It's a distance equal from London to the Middle East.
Wow, far away for
Yeah.
a 14-year-old. Oh, okay, Evie, take it away.
So Ben, you mentioned that there's fewer eyes on this competition on TV. But how do the fans watch the matches? Who covers them?
So I mean, in terms of every game is available to watch online, both live and on demand, on streamer.com.au. So as far as I'm aware, you can probably go back a couple of years to all matches on there. So they cover every game in the NPL Women's. They will cover the State Cup final in a couple of weeks. Then they'll cover the Top 4 Cup, all those games live. Only one game a week has commentary on it, but the other games are there with a camera person covering it. In terms of media coverage other than that, you won't see anything in the... Well, you'll see that you do see the results on a Tuesday in the West Australian, which is the state's newspaper. But in fairness, that's all you see for the men's NPL as well. Perth Glory's signings have made the newspaper, the West Australian, but not the NPL. So in terms of who covers it, it's all volunteers that cover it. So some of the clubs have sort of voluntary media officers. Some of them have photographers. There's do sort of like weekly roundups of what happens, and some that do previews of the games. So there's a guy, Peter, that does it. There's obviously Neil Bennett at Beyond 90, he's also connected, really strong connections with Perth Red Star and Northern Redbacks before them. He coached them. His daughter Carla plays for them still. She's played an incredible over 300 games for that club she's played. So he's a real knowledgeable person about Western Australia women's football. The Perth Football Podcast do a weekly women's show, so that's sort of hosted by Tommy and Kalichi. So Tommy is the commentator. So any game, the one game a week that has commentary on, it's him doing it. And then it's us. It's our website as well. But that's kind of it.
Yeah. So how does that coverage? What role does that play in league success?
I know it's very much appreciated. You get regular, anytime anything comes out, you get messages from the parents of players and the players and and the clubs. I mean, they appreciate the fact that the people that are doing it in their own time. It's taking up hours of their time to do it, but they do it because it's really important to us. It's a great competition that doesn't get the attention that it deserves. There's so many fantastic players in that league. There's so many clubs of amazing stories. Perth Red Star, they are the epitome. They're the dictionary definition of a champion team. You know that if you don't score against them when you get a chance, that sort of about 20 minutes later, whatever happens, they'll go up the pitch and they'll score 2 or 3 goals and they'll win the game because they've got an incredible coach. And although a lot of their players don't really get the A-League women contracts, they are incredibly good at what they do. You've got to give them massive respect. And I think their success in the way that sort of Carlos Vega-Mena, their coach, has done it, and the players that he's got there. They've got players that have been at that club for 8 or 9 years. Players that have played 200 or 300 matches, which, in a league that doesn't have more than 21 league games a year, is huge. And for players to want to play at that same club for so long tells you something about what was originally Northern Redbacks, what is now Perth Red Star. And I think their success and the way they've gone about it has forced the likes of Perth Soccer Club and particularly Balcata this year to go at it and that bit more and sort of really, really strengthen their teams. And that's what's going to make it a very, very competitive sort of last 6 weeks of the season. It's going to be really, really exciting.
Yeah, very good. So is there a big fan base surrounding it? And how has that fan base grown in the past 5 years? Is it changing and evolving?
It's like anything, it varies club by club. I mean, it's not massive, sadly. If you get three figures through the gate, you're doing really, really well. Yes, some clubs do better than others. That's the natural state of affairs. But you've got to also look at the fact that you're going up against, when the NPL runs, you're going up against the AFL, you're going up against the WAFL, which is the state Aussie Rules League, you're going up against the NRL. Occasionally, they've started playing games in Perth occasionally now. So you're competing with a lot of people. So, if the likes of West Coast Eagles or Fremantle Dockers are getting 40 to 50,000 people through the gates every week, it's hard to sort of stick your head above the parapet. I mean, for example, last year, whilst there were Women's World Cup games going on in Perth, the NPL regular season was going on as normal, as nothing had happened, because as part of the rules of the competition, you are not allowed to sort of take advantage of a World Cup. Say, hey, look, there's a really good women's league going on every week here. You couldn't hand out flyers outside. So, hey, look, this is this weekend's fixtures, because it's against the sort of FIFA rules. So, HBF Park sold out for every single game. They were 18 to 20,000 people, but none of those people would have had any idea that they've got their own fantastic competition going on at the same time. And I know that's the rules. That's the rules. So there's nothing you can do, but that was really sad.
Yeah, that's infuriating. So how important is community involvement for the club in the NPLW, especially in WA?
That's it. It's massive. I mean, we've highlighted what Subiaco do, for example. Most of the clubs have got really solid, young girls playing all the way through. So if it's on a match day, you can see back-to-back games. So whether that's sort of the young age group, the under 21s, and then the senior team will all play one after the other. So that's sort of a big community. So I mean, I went and saw Subiaco play Fremantle City a couple of weeks ago, and then at the start of the game, the senior team game, the sort of first team game, there must have been well over 200 people there, solely because you had sort of, the kids are stuck around from the morning with their parents. The senior women's team had just finished their game, so they stuck around to have some food and and a beer, and they were hanging on to watch as well. And quite often, Perth Soccer Club will play games late, so like a 5 o'clock kickoff, so people can either sort of stay on after the men's team have had a home game to watch, or the under 21s have had a home game to watch. So each club has got its own community, which is really lovely, but it's really hard to break out of that community to get a wider fan group.
Ben,
Denise,
why do you follow? Let's do this again. Can you hear me okay? So Ben, why do you follow the NPL Western Australia?
I mean, Western Australia was where I saw my first ever women's football match. So there's that side of it. So that's always kind of been in the background. I think as well, it's the other part of it is because I can only ever be there for 3 weeks, maybe 4 weeks at the most during a year at the current time. So it's kind of a way for me to keep in with the sort of the community and the friends and that I know there. But I think also, because most of the time that I spent in Australia, I spent in Western Australia simply because my family are there. you kind of do become, you do realise that it's very much ignored. And in one way, it's great because it means that Perth is so much slower. It's not massively busy like Sydney or Melbourne are. So that's really great. It's great that sort of Perth and WA in a way are still a secret in that respect, but it does mean that the football community and the women's football community are not really taken much notice of. And I mean, I love the game out there simply because it is community based. It is all volunteers, and there's some amazingly talented players. Seeing some of the players that have come through in the time that I've been, watching the league there. The likes. There are players that will be playing in Europe soon. I hope. The likes of Sneaker Lala, Iskia Brookin. They are players that you can. You've seen at the age of, I don't know, 15, 16, or in the case of Iskia, even younger than that. So there's that kind of excitement side to it, and the fact that you've got an increasing number of them next year that will be part of the A-League women scene under the sort of the new Perth Glory setup as well. So that's quite exciting too.
Tell us about the financial health of the league.
But it's basically there's not much money because it's all sort of volunteer run. Everyone's doing it. Everyone's doing it around their own full-time jobs. You're not a full-time head coach in this league, like with most women's football leagues around the world. There's no money to play. You're doing it because you love the game and you want to try and progress. That said, the standard of the league has got better. Noticeably this year, it's jumped hugely. I mean, there's been big as a result of the Perth getting the World Cup, the Women's World Cup games last year. They've just received a massive chunk of money through sort of like at the legacy that have gone to most of the clubs in the competition to improve facilities and that, because you've got situations where you've got sort of Australia's woken up to women's football in a way. We've kind of known it and loved it ourselves for years, but that's sort of the secret that the Matildas was has sort of got out now. So everywhere in Australia, you've got so many girls that want to be Matildas, but the problem is the clubs don't necessarily. This is not just this is not a Perth situation. This is a global situation. The clubs don't have the facilities or the pitches or the equipment to match the demands that they've now got. As I say, that's not a Perth issue. That's not a Western Australian issue. That's an issue in England, for example, too.
What role do sponsorships play in supporting the league and its teams?
Oh, I mean, that's it's sponsorships, and it's sort of like the sort of the bar and the food take-ins and that kind of thing that keep things going. I mean, obviously, like anything, some clubs do better than others. So if you watch games on the live feeds each week, you'll see some clubs that have, their sort of perimeter fences are sort of brimming with adverts and all the rest of it. But obviously, it's difficult to see how many of those sponsors are actually women specifically sponsors, or how much is it sponsorship for the club, and then within that, how much money the club are putting into the women's programming. That's very different in itself. I think the other interesting thing is that there's a lot of the historically successful men's teams in the NPL don't have women's teams. So, I mean, Perth Glory women were playing out of Macedonia Park the last couple of years. So the men's team that play there, Stirling Macedonia, they don't have a women's team. And there's several other. I mean, we've touched on Ella Lincoln, for example. She's got her family ties are close to the men's side of Bayswater City, who are another successful men's team. They don't have a senior women's team either. So it's interesting that they don't, and whether or not they might start to put one together now. Now that there is promotion and relegation into the NPL in WA. But obviously that promotion and relegation comes with having to meet sort of ground specifications as well.
Yeah. So I'm just trying to imagine myself as a player in in this league, and how does this league sort of just support a player in terms of like the whole player? It's a league without much money. It's a league in a pretty remote place. But if I'm having, say, a mental health issue or issues around things like, do you know anything about the league and how that supports a player?
I mean, honest answer is no, I don't. I do know obviously that like any football associations around the globe, Football West will have specific people within their setup that can sort of help and support in that respect. The extent to which it can be done and how it has been used in the past, I can't really say because I don't have any knowledge of that. But the way things have developed in that sort of sphere of things, I think all football governing bodies have had to take that on board and put that into how they're planning to develop things going forward. So, there will be something there. I do not know off the top of my head what is in place, but there will be something in place.
Yeah, I mean, as a young league, as a league of probably many part timers, this is you want to get that sort of base right so that there is a place. And yeah, I'd like to look into that a little bit more about how, if things go sideways, does it, how something has progressed. Because, you've seen things do go sideways and you got to make sure you support these players on every sort of level. Just speaking of players, I mean, they're sort of, you mentioned a bunch that are churning up into the A leagues. Anything else you want to say in general about how this league supports the upward momentum of Football Australia?
I think in terms of upward momentum, it's because the league is getting much more competitive now for various reasons. And I think, the sort of relentless, incredible nature that Perth Red Star have had has been a big sort of driver in that. It's forced the other teams to sort of say, hey, come on, we've got to, we're not having them winning everything again. And I think the issue, I mean, Australia needs every state to be as strong and as competitive as it can be. I think there will always be issues with what happens to the players in WA. Is there still the fact that they feel they have to go east, they have to leave home to make it as a Matilda, for example? Do you need to leave WA? Do you need to move to Victoria to have a chance of becoming an international player? Not just as a senior international level, but as a young Matilda, for example, as well. I mean, there are players in WA that have said, look, I know that if I want to be an international, I'm going to have to move. That is sad, because I think the more states you have that are stronger and have strong, good quality competitions, that can only be better for the country as a whole. Because if you have everybody basically in 2 states, maybe 3, then what does that do to the rest of the country? It's frustrating. I know South Australia has had similar situations to an extent as well, in terms of their players feel that they have to move east to get recognition. You look at the numbers of players from South Australia or Western Australia that are getting international picks. It's not many. I mean, yes, there are fewer. There's only one professional club in South Australia. There's only one professional club in Western Australia. So, yeah, in that respect, there will be fewer. But I think even if you start to look down at the age group Matilda's teams, it's not as widely spread as it could be. And it can't just be down to the fact that the players that are growing up in Western Australia aren't as good as the players that are in New South Wales or in Victoria. I don't believe that can be the case.
Well, you have a pretty good example there of Sam Kerr growing up in Perth, sort of becoming the best or one of the best players on the planet. You know, they have a pretty good flag bearer out there in WA. Evie, bring us out. Wind us down. I'm sorry, wind us down.
Outro or
we have
questions?
A few more questions about how. Yeah, a few more questions about how this league sort of fits into other leagues, and also like where is it going?
Yeah. So, does the league have any goals or major developments planned, say, in the next 5 years?
I think the fact that we were in the first year this year of having a promotion and relegation is huge in itself. You know, because it meant that there was a few years where we had, you know, one team in particular losing very heavily every week, and obviously there was never any potential danger for them in losing their status in the league. So the fact that there is now promotion and relegation, subject of course to the team coming up having ground conditions and actually wanting to make the jump as well, because that's a whole other kettle of fish. That sort of makes the jeopardy that bit more, and it forces up the quality. So, you know, there's been two teams battling away all season to avoid the potential one relegation battle. At the moment, perhaps Mandurah will come up, which will be really interesting, because Mandurah is not in the Perth metropolitan area at all. They're right at the very end of one of the railway lines from Perth. So that in itself would be really interesting if Mandurah came up next year. So that's the first area. I think there's another issue with the State Cup at the moment, because despite the fact that teams are seemingly want to be able to prove that they're worthy of promotion if they want to, only one of the teams in the league below opted to effectively take part in the competition this year. So when the draw was made, and pretty much, I think off the top of my head, I believe only one team from the league below played their match and didn't forfeit, which is really disappointing, because I think if you want a competitive league below, and if you want to be taken seriously about wanting promotion, then, you know, play a cup game and see how you match up against teams in the league above. Whether that means you sort of change the structure of the competition to make it more viable for the lower clubs, then that's something that could be looked at. You could look at maybe having sort of like the bottom two from the NPL play off against some of the teams in the league below in a first sort of round playoff, so that it's stronger teams from the league below that come in. I don't know how that works, but that's something that I think would be useful. And again, something that's not, as far as I know, has not been talked about by the powers that be, would be a chance for all of the NPL women's winners from all the various states and territories to actually sort of play off against each other to see who the overall NPL champions for the whole country would be. I mean, that's something that obviously would involve players that are not paid, have to take time off of work in order to do it. And obviously there'd all be sort of a lot of funding issues in terms of travelling and where you would play it. But that would be really interesting.
So, last but not least, how do you see the NPLW overall just influencing the future of women's football in Australia?
If we look at the fact that, you know, the A-League women is kind of like the showcase for the next generation of Matildas in a way. So then in a way, sort of the NPL being beneath that is kind of potentially the next generation after that in a way, because there's a lot of young players. I mean, there's an awful lot of experienced players in the league that are very, very good and are worthy of A-League contracts. You know, players at 26, 27. But being only one pro team in the state, and the fact that obviously you want to be competitive in the league, it's very hard for people to get those sort of pro contracts in the league, which is a shame. But But there's probably going to have probably six or seven WA players in the Perth Glory team next season, which is quite a lot by recent standards. But yeah, there's so many other players. You think, oh, you would be amazing if you played A-League women. But there's not the places for everybody, and people aren't necessarily going to come over from Melbourne Victory or Sydney FC to watch the NPL in Western Australia to look for players necessarily.
Yeah. So I'm going to take us out. Thanks, Ben. Thanks for listening to the Impetus Podcast, where we celebrate the pride, passion, and achievements of women in football. Don't forget to subscribe. Thank you so much for joining us. Until next time.